So I'd like to hand over first to the European Commission, Jacob. He's been with the Commission for the past 7 years and leading the climate negotiations on carbon mechanisms the last 5 years. He's an international lawyer by training and has been following the UN climate talks since the early 90s in various capacities. So over to you, Jacob. What are you excited about next week, and what can we expect?
So thanks very much for the opportunity to join you all this afternoon, just to make a few reflections on expectations for COP25. I should start by saying that I think the EU and the rest of the parties to the Paris Agreement view COP25 as being about much more than international carbon markets and Article 6. It's yet another critical opportunity for governments, but also civil society, private sector, local authorities to come together and express their support for the Paris Agreement and for climate action. Having said that, obviously Article 6 is one of the main negotiating tasks that we have in front of us for COP25. And it is very important, in our view, to come to an agreement on Article 6 in order to make sure that carbon markets function properly internationally. I think, as you'll be hearing from other speakers, we, as the EU, believe that international carbon markets can lower compliance costs. They can stimulate investments in communities that might not otherwise have received those investments for climate action, and they can therefore raise ambition, but only if this happens under the right conditions. We have to make sure that through what we agree in Paris, through what we will agree in Madrid, and very importantly through the bilateral relationships that we construct amongst us, that we properly align the incentives of participants in carbon markets in order to achieve more ambition and more climate action. And this means, of course, one of many things, but it means accounting properly for those transactions. It's also important, I think, to point out that Paris alone, and even the additional decisions that we agreed in Katowice, do not create those right conditions. In fact, it could be said that Paris, in its design, doesn't particularly help in creating the right conditions for international carbon markets. They don't create a common currency. The fact that we allowed each party to design and define its own level of ambition and the way in which it will participate in carbon markets individually in a nationally determined way means that we've ended up with NDCs of a very different type and character that don't lend themselves well for clear and accountable international carbon markets. The collective ambition of those NDCs, we all know, is not enough. And so international carbon markets, the right conditions in which we have a strong demand generated by high levels of ambition has also not been put in place as a result of Paris. So Article 6 represents at the moment our best opportunity to improve the conditions under which international carbon markets might operate, and particularly how we can better manage and regulate the risks associated with carbon markets. And I think that really is the challenge for the negotiations now, is putting in place those rules. Over the past couple of years, I think we've deepened our understanding as the international community of what those risks look like. From the outset, we recognized that there would be a risk under the Paris Agreement of double counting. And so we have to put in place rules that ensure that no two parties are using the same emissions reductions represented by a unit transferred under the Paris Agreement to achieve to demonstrate that they are achieving their NDCs. So no double counting, both within Paris, but also, I think very importantly, no double counting as between the units that are used to demonstrate achievement in Paris and other international purposes, in particular with the new emerging regime under ICAO, the CORSIA offsetting regime for commercial aviation. So that risk has to be managed, and we've made some important steps forward in the rules that we've agreed so far, particularly in Katowice, that risk would be managed by ensuring that all parties participating in Article 6 make a corresponding adjustment to their emissions balance to demonstrate that they have either transferred the right to claim those emissions reductions to another party, or that they have used those emissions reductions to demonstrate achievement of their own NDCs. There's more detail to be elaborated there, but that's one first very important risk and very important rule that needs to be tightened up as a result of the Article 6 negotiations. That rule being applicable to all aspects of Article 6 and in particular 6.4 as well as 6.2. The other very important risk I think that we've come to understand and to quantify in the ensuing years is the risk of the carryover, the unlimited carryover of pre-2020 units generated under the Kyoto Protocol to the post-2020 period. As I said, the Paris NDCs don't represent sufficient ambition as they are drafted and agreed and as will be implemented by parties. So carrying over tons representing emissions reduced pre-2020 into the post-2020 space will not be an opportunity for carbon markets to raise ambition, but rather potentially to lower them. So the second set of rules that we'll be negotiating in Madrid will address that second risk as well. There are other aspects of the rules and other kinds of risks that we'll seek to manage that include how we manage the accounting for the use of international carbon markets for those parties that have single-year targets. That's something that we will have to elaborate further. How we will manage those parties that want to trade in emissions reductions that are not quantified in terms of carbon dioxide tons equivalent, but rather non-greenhouse gas emissions reductions, such as the achievement of certain policy objectives like improvements in energy efficiency or the installation of renewables. And then very importantly, the rules governing the way in which the new Article 6.4 mechanism will identify, verify, and certify emissions reductions under its operations. We want to make sure that we learn as many lessons as possible from what we have experienced under the clean development mechanism, which I think most observers agreed produced a large quantity of low quality units. We don't want to replicate that experience as we get the Article 6.4 mechanism up and running. So let me stop there. Look forward to the discussion, but at least that's the way in which we're looking to the opportunities presented by COP25 is to really put in place rules that ensure the environmental integrity of the system, that ensure that there is no double counting, and that avoids the mistakes that we've made in the past in terms of the design and implementation of international carbon markets.
Okay, thank you very much, Jacob. One follow-up at this stage. What you're saying all sounds very sensible, certainly from a climate perspective. At the same time, you started off by saying neither Paris nor Katowice really put us on the right path. In fact, Paris wasn't very helpful in creating an obvious way forward for carbon markets. So at this point, how close together are different parties to taking things forward in the way you have described, and where do you see the big sticking points?
Well, what I said was that Paris alone did not create the right conditions for robust and effective international carbon markets for driving ambition, and in fact, elements of its design make it more challenging. We're now responding to that challenge by trying to fill some of the gaps with these additional rules that we need to put in place. Parties still are apart on many of these issues, and I think that depends in part on where they see their interests lying. With regard to the carryover of pre-2020 units, just to use that as an example, there are a number of parties that hold significant numbers of these pre-2020 units and want to be able to use them internationally. And I think what part of the negotiations is to really highlight the risks to ambition that will present if we simply carry over these units, and try to help parties make decisions that are in the global interest rather than simply looking at what their national interests might be.
Okay, thank you.